What I bring is absolute total focus on putting working people first. I have done it here. These are not words, these are deeds. That's what paid sick leave is, that's what pre-K is, and after school is, that's what guaranteed health care is. These are realities that just change people's lives. I intend to break the mold, and I intend to make history, and I intend to win.
Good evening and welcome to Metro Focus. I'm Jack Ford. It's official. After weeks of hinting at a presidential run, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio has joined the fray. The mayor is now the 24th Democrat to enter the 2020 presidential race, joining a crowded field led by candidates, many of whom have much higher national profiles. In New York, there are those who are skeptical of the mayor's presidential bid. In fact, a Quinnipiac poll last month showed 76% of New York voters believed he should not run. History also against him. No sitting mayor has ever been elected to the presidency. President Trump reacted to the news on Twitter, calling Mayor de Blasio, quote, the worst mayor in the U.S., adding, if you like high taxes and crime, he's your man, NYC hates him, end quote. Mayor de Blasio will now travel to Iowa and South Carolina, some of the first steps in the long slog of a primary campaign. Joining us now to talk about the mayor's chances and what this all means for the city as he starts his run is our good friend Ben Max, executive editor of the Gotham Gazette. Ben, it's always good to see you here.
Thanks,
and
Jack.
we always seem to have a lot of things to talk about when you come to visit us. So let's start off with, why now?
Well, I think he took a lot of time to decide, as you sort of hinted at there, and I think he was genuinely deciding, is this something I want to do? And this is a mayor who we've known has been late politically to certain things. Look at his lack of endorsement and then finally getting on board with Hillary Clinton in the last presidential election. So I think he was genuinely trying to figure out if this is something he really wanted to do. As you noted, there has not been a clear chorus of people saying, run, Bill, run.
Yeah. How can he be hurt, you think, by the lateness of entering into the fray?
Well, the field is so big and fairly established, and you've started to see people gravitate towards certain candidates, although I would say that other than some of the support for people like Bernie Sanders, who ran last time and retained some of the core he had, there are probably people who are considering a variety of candidates, and when they're polled, they might be going with someone who they're favoring at that time, but it is a long road ahead. There won't be votes cast in Iowa until next year, so there's a lot of time here. But coming in at this juncture, you have to wonder, who's the audience? Who hasn't sort of said, you know, I'm liking what Elizabeth Warren's saying. I'm liking Kamala Harris. I'm a Bernie guy. I'm a Biden woman. You know, there's a lot of people who have already sort of gotten interested in candidates.
Staked out their territory, if you will, certainly. Might there be a positive for him coming in, essentially being what we think now is the last one into the race?
Yeah, you'd have to think he maybe. You know, who knows? You'd like to think he might be the last one. I mean, it's getting a little bit absurd at this point. But yes, he gets to make some waves. Maybe his news cycle getting into the race is a little bit longer than we've seen for some others who have another candidate following right behind them. Right. So there could be something to that, depending on how successfully this rollout goes, the trip to Iowa, the trip to South Carolina. Can he create some good buzz? Does he have some policy proposals to roll out? We shall see how well he handles this initial phase of the campaign if he can get some buzz going. One of the concerns for him, I think, is that he doesn't have a big team assembled. A lot of his old advisors are not with him this go around.
Working for other people
They're working for other people. There are people who become a bit disillusioned with him. So there's a lot of questions about how he's going to pull off even the early phase to see if he can get some momentum going.
It's interesting that in the era of modern day politics, being the mayor of New York has not been a springboard to higher office. We mentioned John Lindsay wanted to run for president while he was a sitting mayor, did not work for him. We saw Ed Koch try to run for governor, didn't work. We know more recently, we've seen Michael Bloomberg as a possibility, Rudy Giuliani as a possibility. It doesn't catapult people into that higher office. But what is he going to argue? What's he going to say as to why it should be different for him and why he can bring something from his tenure as the mayor of New York that would be valuable to the nation?
We do need, I think, a little bit more of a study around the country as to why being mayor of New York City seems like a bit of a dead end and why people that don't even know Mayor de Blasio so well seem to not like him around the country. But we'll leave that aside for a second. He's going to offer this blend of progressive agenda and executive experience. He's going to say, I've done it. He's already saying that. I've done it in New York City, and I can do it for the country by implementing policies as he's lining up that help working people. And we'll see exactly how he defines it. I think he's going to take a very broad definition to what working people means, but he's going to talk about things like universal pre-kindergarten, maybe even coupling that like he has in the city with after-school programs, higher taxes on the wealthy, healthcare, you name it. He's going to offer to voters across the country sort of this vision for doing more from the government for working people to put some of the money back in their pockets.
And there can be some power, don't you think, to the notion of saying they're all promising you, if you give them a chance, they think they can do it. And he can say, I've done it.
Absolutely. I mean, even a vice president like Joe Biden can't necessarily stake his claim to too many things that he personally made happen. I mean, he'll try to, certainly take some credit for anything that happened in the Obama presidency. But then you have a bunch of U.S. senators who've spent a lot of time in the minority. There are real questions as to what accomplishments people can point to. And he's been the chief executive of a city, Democratic mayor with a Democratic city council, and he's been able to push through a lot of things. Crime is low, jobs are high. He has, and this can be a detriment to some, but he's expanded the city budget in such a significant way that he's got a lot of programs he can say, look at the way I took all of city government to make it more equitable for people in New York City. So he's got some things to run on. There's also some crises that we know that are here in the city that he should have to account for. We'll see if voters make him account for those things like homelessness, the public housing crisis, his inattention to mass transit for too much of his mayoralty. But I don't know that those things will matter to voters. He's had campaign finance scandals. We'll see. Is he going to get asked about that in Iowa? I don't know.
We mentioned crime. Crime is definitely lower, significantly lower, yet he's never had a good relationship with the NYPD, especially the unions involved there. Unions, NYPD representatives, apparently union representatives, protesting him when he's making the announcement outside the studio. Does that carry over, do you think, nationally?
So the main police union, the PBA, has had actually been following him on the road at times throughout his mayoralty. So that could certainly hurt him if they continue to do that, and they may very well do that. And that's all part of their contract negotiating. And they've done that with mayors, Democrat and Republican. They really take those sort of tough negotiating practices all over the city and all over the country. So that could absolutely hurt him, because if the media in some of these places see that in their areas, then it starts to seep into their coverage more than if they have to go back and figure out what's going back in New York City.
Last question for you. Obviously, he's going to have to be something of an absentee mayor. And he's been known to be a micromanager, not somebody who likes to delegate. It's his style of managing. But there's going to be a vacuum. Do you think that's going to accelerate the race for the next mayor of New York? We're going to see people sort of starting to fill that vacuum earlier than they might otherwise?
I think that's a great point, and I think yes is the answer. I mean, there's no question that the folks that are lining up to run for mayor are going to see a bit of a vacuum here. The mayor is going to have to be very strategic about how often he comes back from the trail, the time he spends, the events that he has, the clarity with which he's making decisions. I think a lot of New Yorkers see this as a bit offensive, that he is not happy with the job he has leading the city. He's got 2.5 more years of his term, and now he's going to run for a higher office when there's real problems to deal with at home. And you've seen some of those 2021 contenders already say things like that when the mayor was considering this run. We have a lot of problems here. I think we should deal with those.
Well, the candidacy has been launched, and we'll see where it goes. Ben, we're always smarter after we spend some time talking with you. Thanks so much for visiting. We'll talk again real soon.